going to start up with our afternoon sessions. And thank you so much for joining us, whether on site here or on Zoom, and then the others who are conference attendees who will be watching later. And our afternoon plenary panel is Unmasked, boosting the conversation on COVID vaccines. What I'm going to do is go through the summary. You have it on Eventbrite. I'll go through the conference summary that we have there, introduce our panelists. Dr. Potter, you've already heard from both last night if you watched the Zoom panel discussion, but I'll introduce him as well, and then again, our panelists. So Unmasked, boosting the conversation on COVID vaccines. Peacemaking does not always entail agreement, but working through various matters in more complete and respectful terms. The need for expanding our analysis of issues to be more comprehensive and seeking to be more respectful of the respective parties in a debate proves beneficial in the long run for very controversial topics like COVID vaccines and masks. No matter how long COVID is with us or whether some other pandemic takes its place, we will need to cultivate better strategies for engaging one another on this and other contentious issues. The aim of this panel discussion is threefold: model how to raise good questions, engage in respectful dialogue, and account for the various complexities in working toward a possible resolution. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then our moderator in just a second here. So I'm just going by who I see first on my list here. So Mr. Phil Berlin, Master of Divinity degree from Multnomah Seminary, is a son of Jamaican immigrants, was born and raised in Northeast Portland, and is a husband and father. He has served in various ministry roles in Northeast Portland, primarily in African American churches. Over the past 20 years, he has worked in banking and finance while completing a Bachelor's of Arts and Master of Divinity degrees from Multnomah University. During his studies, he has developed a heart for Old Testament, biblical theology, Trinitarian thought, and African American church history. He is currently pursuing a Doctor of Ministry degree from Portland Seminary, focusing on the theological and cultural impact of the African American church in the city of Portland. And I must say, I've already said it to my good friend, you're really looking sharp today. I usually see you with a t-shirt and a baseball cap. Never from one of my preferred teams, but that said, you are really looking sharp, Pastor. So, Mr. Phil Berlin. Now, Trudy Sang, Pastor Sang, whom you heard from already this morning, serves as New Wineskin's Advisory Council co-chair and New Wine Disability Advocate. And I've already gone through your summary already, but I'm just going to say this about Trudy is that she has just been a lifeline for New Wine over the years in so many settings, working through controversial issues. And whether it's on disabilities, whether it's on multi-faith engagement, just a real leader at New Wine in that regard. And Pastor Berlin is also a leader on New Wine's Advisory Council. Next up would be Dr. Kristen White, who is the Assistant Professor and Director of Master of Arts in Counseling at Multnomah University. By no means an assistant, she really leads the charge in so many spheres at the university. So not simply an assistant professor, but a lead professor. And I think that we are assisting you much of the time. So she is a clinical psychologist who has worked in a variety of settings, including community mental health, a college counseling center, and private practice. Dr. White enjoys working with adults related to personal growth, mood disorders, and spiritual issues on an individual level. She has worked with all ages for one-on-one, couples, family, and group counseling. She identifies as an assimilative integrationist with a psychodynamic backbone. I'd love to hear that unpack more. That's fascinating. I mean, we should do a whole conference just on that theme. Kristen has taught at 3 other Christian universities in Southern California and was previously the director of clinical training at one of them. She is passionate about spreading therapeutic tools and information beyond the therapy, office, and classroom. Kristen loves the authentic, deep thinking, family-oriented, and Christ-following faculty, along with the engaged, hardworking, fun, and capable students at Multnomah. She loves the deep commitment to Christ and his word, balanced by a deep commitment to accepting a diversity of opinions and people. And Dr. White, thank you so much for collaborating with us on this conference. And I believe we have behind us an imposing figure, larger than life, Pastor Cody Whittington. He serves as the lead pastor for the Table Community, a highly relational and non-traditional church in Belgrade, Montana. Cody has 11 years of pastoral ministry experience in student ministry, worship, discipleship, and church planning. He and his wife, Christy, have 3 kids, Cove, Maggie, and Audrey. They moved from Georgia in 2017 to help start the Table, but are originally from Texas. Currently, what town in Texas? What city in Texas?
Probably best just to say Tyler.
Okay, Tyler, Texas. Currently, Cody is concluding his doctorate of ministry in cross-cultural engagement and the church at Multnomah Biblical Seminary. He is looking forward to starting his PhD, where he will concentrate on the work of Leslie Newbegin. I thought you were going to deal with Bonhoeffer too. That's why I asked you to be on this panel. Cody enjoys teaching on the intersection of theology, culture, and the church. In his free time, he enjoys the outdoor fun of Montana with his family. And Pastor Whittington also serves on New Wineskins Advisory Council. I've really enjoyed being able to work with him and Trudy this year as they finish up their doctoral studies before their major projects, papers. Now also Dr. Robert Potter. I've already introduced him once at this conference, so I'm going to provide a brief summary if you don't mind, sir. Dr. Potter is a bit of a polymath. In addition to his doctorate of medicine, he has a doctorate of religion, psychology, and ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School. As I alluded to last night, he's really been a great gift from God to us over the last 14, 15 months with our son's traumatic brain injury. He's been in all the major consultations with us, from the South where it occurred to when he was transported up here, and many times a week we're on the phone. And I'm just really grateful for Dr. Potter. We met through the seminary's grant through the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science for Seminaries grant. He was one of our science advisors, and New Wineskins oversaw the coordination of that grant. I would have never thought that he would also be a mentor beyond the classroom in terms of our family situation. And we're so grateful for you. I should say too, that one of the areas that he really helped shape our seminary in terms of the discussion was in terms of social psychology and how to navigate complex issues. And he was talking about that in his workshop today. It was a very stimulating conversation on that theme. So he's going to bring in his work in social psychology as he moderates and engages our panelists, and then also the matter of drawing from his medical ethics background and medicine. But again, Dr. Potter, Pastor Sang, Pastor Berlin, Dr. White, Pastor from Tyler, Texas, Cody Whittington, thank you so much for leading the charge. We have now until 2 o'clock. So thank you, sir.
I've always thought of ethics as being at the center of all human decisions. I define ethics as searching for good reasons for action. And that's what we're going to be exploring today with our panel. I have a very difficult task to do, one that I have no idea how to do, and that is to keep quiet and not answer the questions that I'm asking. After 50 years of providing answers to questions, this will be a new experience. But I will put it in form of three questions. The first question is what I call the question of what's going on here. The second question is, what values ought we to protect? And the third is, what's the fitting response to what's going on here. I learned that from James Gustafson, who was my teacher of theological ethics at the University of Chicago, and he was a primary student of H. Richard Niebuhr of Yale, who invented those questions to help guide us in our thinking. So here's the way it'll be, panel. I'm going to ask you in this order, if you will answer in these orders. I'll have Trudy go first, and then Phil go second, and then Cody, you're third, and Kristen, you're fourth in the series of answers. I want to ask the question, and you all get an answer. Now, I've done a little calculation, and they each have 3 minutes and 42 seconds in order to get this all in by 2 o'clock. So they will be succinct and powerful in their responses. The first question is, what's going on here? How do you measure the risks of COVID? What are the COVID risks and threats to our mental and physical health and our economic health and the general health of the population? So here you go, Trudy.
Good afternoon, and I'm going to be addressing it from not just the disability population and the people that I serve, but also because I do community networking within my church as well. Primarily, the harm or the most stressful thing is, in both cases, is the isolation. I mean, much of the disability population was isolated to begin with, and then you take all services, programming, and other things away. And now you've got people that are trying to figure out ways to survive financially, that are trying to do 24/7 care within their homes with fear. And so fear was another piece, isolation and fear. And then anxiety, because then it's, how do you protect these people that in some cases are not really realizing the impact of what's going on? And so, like, for example, people like my son, he doesn't know about all this, but he just knows for over a year and a half, he wasn't connecting with anybody outside of the family. And then you think of these people that are dealing with, they have to overcome sensory input in social settings, and then you withdraw that, it means that the anxiety just went up. So then you see kids and individuals and adults and many others elevating in anxiety. So you're looking at gagging, you're looking at stressing out, you're looking at acting out, you're looking at reactions behaviorally that has become very problematic. And then you're trying to calm that anxiety down. Then you've got people that are yet, in some cases that I work with, that with some moms that are single moms that are dealing with people at home, they're trying to figure out how to survive. And who do you trust, and how can you get out, and how can you protect this person who's so vulnerable to begin with and still go forward? And so that complexity is laid upon it. Then you deal with the church at large and the community who is going, what are we going to do? And how can we address these needs that are just compounding and elevating within our community? And I live in the suburbs of Portland, so it's Tigard area. And so we're looking at people that are needing food resourcing and other kinds of resources and supports, and as well as the spiritual and emotional supports. So all of those things have just escalated. Then you've got the elderly, and that's another population that I speak into. And they are so starved for attention and isolation and feeling left out in many cases, and not aware of how to even connect with others. And what they could depend on before is now gone. And now we're looking at some of those compound stresses and anxieties just continuing to escalate. How do we address those? It's something we're really trying to face into.
Thank you, Judy. Phil.
All right. So I guess I can frame this in a couple of ways. One of the most shocking things for me during the, Sure. One of the most shocking things that occurred to me during the pandemic was the lack of consideration for the most vulnerable among us. That was the initial shock that I ended up having. And what I mean by that is the original conversation, right, was the people that are going to be most impacted are the immune compromised and the elderly. My parents are in their 80s. My daughter that I live with is immune compromised. This was a real thing to me. So, I mean, I'm willing to sacrifice people I love, for this? No. And then now thinking of just now where we are, and we're coming out of, where mask mandates are being lifted and everything. And yeah, hearing people talk about, well, I don't want to wear a mask anymore. Why do we have to go get this? Why do we have to do that? Wait a second. There's people that are out here that, are you willing to compromise? Are you willing to lose because of this? That was just the initial shock to me. So when we think of this in light of individual liberties, that's not the question that I have. I have people that I have to take care of. I have people that I have to protect. So now coming out of this, here's the situation we're dealing with, right? So the shock of getting back into large groups. My daughter is a social butterfly. When she was really small, she would consistently run up to strangers and say, hey, grandpa, hey, grandma. This is what she did. And for the better half of the past 3 years, she's been in the house, only around her family. So now coming out and being around people, she was able to go to school this year. And then when the mask came off, she's now back at home. That has changed her life drastically. And I'm afraid it's actually going to change her, as she grows up. My wife, anyone here that knows my wife knows she's a social butterfly as well. But again, been in the house and still has a lot of trauma just going into public now. Anytime a large gathering like this, if my wife was here, she'd be against one of the walls, because just the fear of being around other people and the possibility that we may bring something back home that may impact our daughter. So just the shock and awe of being around that, and just the fray. But then the last thing is, I don't think we can separate this moment of the pandemic from the names of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, or Breonna Taylor. This is another thing that has changed us as a city and us as a country, where these are things that we're gonna have to talk about. So all of these things that we're just in for the long haul as we go into these next few years and come out of wearing masks regularly. We're gonna have to go into thinking, okay, how do I respond to these things and give people grace as we go forward?
Thank you. Phil, Cody? Cody, unmute, buddy. There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Potter. Trudy, Pastor Berlin, thank you so much. I will do my best to just try to come at this from a pastoral angle. That's probably not a bad word, though, anger, that has surfaced quite a bit in the conversations that I've had as a pastor in rural Montana. And, New York Times put out an article. They did describe the pandemic in 6 words or less last year. And kind of bouncing off of what Pastor Berlin just shared, there was something intrinsic that you can't just simply separate everything from or isolate everything from COVID to Floyd. And one of the people said, in 6 words or less, they described the pandemic as Floyd fires COVID, I can't breathe. That was how they decided to describe it. And in each of those contexts, there's the struggle for breathing, trying to get your sense of life, your sense of meaning, value, purpose, trying to make sense of all of that throughout the pandemic. And so it's very complex. And so I'm coming at this as a pastor, not as an immunologist, not as an expert on vaccines or anything like that. And so I feel like I'm a little bit out of my territory here, but I'm just going to share, I guess, from the physical, mental, economic, individual liberty standpoints that I've experienced as a pastor. I think the interesting thing about the physical dynamics of COVID-19 and everything that we faced, just how differently COVID-19 affected individuals. It didn't play by the rules. It doesn't play by the rules. And early on, there was a general awareness of, hey, here are some things that we can expect. But then as time progressed, we realized that it doesn't follow those rules. And so I think the generalities that we assumed, it just didn't play by the rules. And so we our church immediately went into lockdown as soon as the first case hit. It was the day after when our church decided that we're not going to meet. We had one case in Montana when we decided to stop meeting. And there's a lot of other challenges that came with that on the emotional health, mental health sort of things. That I think, as Trudy said, the threat of extended isolation is a big one. I think one of the things that I didn't expect was how impactful the disruption of normative patterns of life could cause some challenges. And so, again, I'm not a therapist, but most of my time during the pandemic, and even to this day, is spent just listening to people try to struggle through this and process it and make sense of it through a theological, relational lens. And some of the things that we saw was COVID seemed to expose emotional health, mental health issues that had long been hidden or suppressed or tucked away. And then it created a host of new things that families were trying to get used to. And so you have parents who are with their kids only about 3 hours total a day, now being with their children 8 hours a day, trying to navigate that. In addition, parents, spouses who were only used to seeing each other in the morning and the evenings, now spending a large amount of time with one another. And this created just a lot of unique opportunities and challenges. But throughout the pandemic, we saw a lot of depression in our church. We saw suicide, and we saw some marriages go through some really intense things, and in some cases end. And so I think that the COVID is more than just a virus. It's something that has infected the fabric of our entire being as people. Again, as that headline said, Floyd fires COVID, I can't breathe. That's what a summary. On the economic front, again, I think that, as Trudy said, I think the challenge in our context, I live in an area that's not affluent. And I think the challenge in our context is the stay at home became very challenging and almost a luxury for many people as it went on. There was not enough support. There was not enough policy in place, or things happening. Like Trudy said, again, there was a struggle to make ends meet. And for many, staying at home, so for some it was mandatory. There's nothing they could do about it. For others, it was that they could do it and be fine. And for others, it was just this tension of trying to hop from job to job that would allow them to come in so that they could make money to provide for their family. And so there was no easy answers on that front. And just on the individual liberties thing, I echo a lot of what Pastor Berlin said. I think the focus on who are we trying to care for is essential. When that first case came to Montana, it was on the last day of our corporate church gathering. I've had this in quotes, and we repeated this throughout our time as a church navigating this. Don't confuse the challenges ahead with persecution, individual persecution. That was something that, don't confuse the challenges of the pandemic with individual persecution. I think there's this sort of martyrdom complex, especially in evangelical circles, that any sort of pressure feels like persecution at times. And so I think it's highly misguided, but I think that's a lot of what we saw as COVID unfolded. I think there were certain situations where we forget that in any given context, the church is sent into this cultural moment to witness to the self-sacrificial love of Jesus Christ. And when that trumps the individual liberties then just kind of begins to be that question, at least in the life of the church, becomes a little less significant when we have the right frame of mind of sacrificial love of Jesus for the sake of others. Again, it's a highly complex issue, but just to wrap it up, I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Cody.
What a 2 years we've had, right? And I love how Phil and Cody are mentioning it's COVID, but it's all these other things that have happened in our country, in our world. And Trudy, I really appreciate you highlighting the isolation, the losses. I mean, the losses are just endless, right? Because they're not just loved ones, but jobs and stability, coping mechanisms, social supports, church, right? They just go on and on. And so when we come to talking about mental health, which has been mentioned, it's a mess, right? You probably know that either through your own experience or your family or your loved ones. Mental health is a mess 2 years into this. Let me give you a few stats. According to the World Health Organization, they say that COVID, again, can't be separated by everything else the last 2 years, but the last 2 years, we'll call it COVID, triggered a 25% increase in anxiety and depression. And that's around the world. I think the US is higher than that. And there's also specific groups that are higher than that. The World Health Organization and others name both young people and women as even higher than that rate. So if you look through the research, there's lots of stats that anxiety and depression have gone up 4 to 6 times during the last 2 years. So 4 to 6 times more people in our country are now struggling with or diagnosed with depression and anxiety as opposed to 2 years ago. It's pretty huge. Suicide ideation and attempts and intent has also gone up. In young people, they think it has doubled, which is the depression and beyond that. Substance use also, both new use, increased abuse. I saw one stat, I can't figure out where I saw it. It might've been the New York Times, that parents who had children elementary school age, over 50% of them reported a significant increase in alcohol use. So over half of the parents in our nation who have elementary school kids have been drinking quite a bit more. Now, some that's moderated and it's when the kids go to bed, right? And some it's a lot more significant and a lot more out of control. As a psychologist, I mean, if you've tried to seek help for any friend or family member, you know, a 2-month waiting list at this point is really good because therapists are inundated. And if you need a spot at an inpatient facility for substance abuse or an eating disorder, you might have to wait 6 months. The incident rates are so high for all these things, but probably our care facilities, if anything, have shrunk, right? Because we had to close everything. And some people have started doing different things or they have less capacity. And so the rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, eating disorder, suicidality, all of this is exploding, but our resources are probably going the other way, if anything. Yeah, it's awful in terms of mental health. And just this week, the American Psychological Association president said, if we look at what we've seen from trauma in the past, we should expect that while we can hope, Dr. Potter or someone else can speak to this, but while we can hope the COVID pandemic has peaked, and we might be shifting into a new phase, the mental health pandemic will probably last 7 to 10 years as we're working out all of the consequences of this, according to the APA president. So pretty astounding. I could talk more about why, stats, but yeah, mental health is very much a mess right now for a lot of people.
Thank you all, panel. That's been a very fine summary of the consequences, the risks that we're up against, and the measuring of the risks. There's one measurement that I, as physician, am particularly interested in: the number of infections, the number of hospitalizations, and the number of deaths. Just locating it in Oregon, there have been now, rounding off the numbers a little, 700,000 infections reported. 4% of those have been hospitalized. 7,000 have died. That's 1%. In measuring the risks from my point of view, I've said, as you pointed out, everybody's pointed out, there's never total safety. You just have to decide how much risk you will take. I said to myself, okay, I thought I felt reasonably comfortable with the ordinary influenza. So I said, I'll do a little research. How many people in Oregon died in 2019 from ordinary influenza? The number is 500. If you assume a 4-month period of infection of ordinary influenza, that comes out to about 5 a day. So ask yourself, and I will give you an answer, how many died each day last week from COVID? The answer is 20. The difference between 20 and 5 is not the risk I'm willing to accept at this point. And that's the way I, as physician, am measuring a consequence, a risk that we are up against right now. These other threats that we've all carefully annotated are absolutely the consequences, the psychological consequences, the economic consequences, all the consequences of this disruption. Here's the second question, however, which you've already touched on, but repeat and go a little deeper. What values that we hold dear, what values are threatened by this pandemic? And can you name which of those we ought to be careful to protect? Now, there will be a third question, and that third question is, what kind of action can we take to protect those values? But try to articulate again for us. You started that out very, very well. You started it out, all 4 of you. But tell me again, what are the values? And maybe even sort out somewhat those conflicted values that we ought to protect. Carry on. Start with Trudy.
So one area that I forgot to touch on is grief, because those that lost loved ones during the pandemic, it was incredibly hard to process grieving. I was one of those. I lost a sister doing it. And how do you process when you can't gather, can't be together, can't process? And that was a horrendous stress. And still people are trying to deal with how to process the loss of loved ones. And so that was one component I forgot to mention. But really, what I saw when I would look at our church, and our church tried to be very compliant to the rulings that were being handed out, and we were in connection with the Washington County CDC and all of those things, was trying to deal with the idea of respect. I mean, like when Phil talks about his family and like my vulnerable population, respecting, even if you didn't believe in masking or vaccine, the idea of respecting those that were vulnerable or at risk, that you could put aside that piece of you to be able to still be present in the lives of others and to serve others. And that was an interesting puzzle to watch some folks try and wrestle through. And I mean, in my mind, it was like, well, okay, yeah, the mask can be annoying, but I can push through that if it means I get to at least help somebody or be present in somebody's life. I mean, that's a small sacrifice for me. But for others, that was such a different story. And so that tension of respect of others that may not be as strong in immune system or in their vulnerability, but also to just the idea of really hearing out the story and not jumping to an impulsive conclusion is also another piece of the story. And so trying to really see the whole picture and addressing it holistically rather than just that's what's comfortable for me or for the community that I'm comfortable with. And so pushing through those barriers and trying to educate people on how to do things safely, respectfully, and in love and mercy and compassion was something that you would think that in our Christian circles would seem normal, was actually having to be such a deep conversation.
Thank you, Trudy. Phil?
So as I consider this question, the idea of individual liberties and thinking what are some of the values that's being challenged, that to me is like the one I want to take off the board. Like, I don't want to consider individual liberties now. There's the least of these. They're the most vulnerable that we need to be more concerned with. And that's been the thing that's been on my mind this whole time. Again, I work at a residential drug and alcohol rehab center. And we're 20 some odd guys that live there now. And when we were doing COVID and everyone's wearing masks, and we're wearing masks right now, and we were allowing volunteer groups to come back in. I remember one volunteer group, we're getting ready to sign up, and we're letting everyone know, hey, you guys, wear a mask, all that kind of stuff. And then, but we gave them the option to do a program, like a kind of a service, church service, something like that. And they're like, no, we all think we're gonna, cook meal and then go. And then some way or another, my friend that was talking to this volunteer said, you realize they live in a bubble, they don't go anywhere, so you're the threat to them? And when that dawned on them, they're like, oh, wait a second. Oh, well, yeah, I guess if you guys want us to do a service, we will. If you guys want us to be a part of your community and allow us to do this, we will. Because they came in with the mindset that a couple of guys who are recently homeless and things like that, or a bunch of addicts would be the ones that would share COVID when they don't go outside. So yeah, it was a weird thing. But this is the thing that I work in every day. And so I walk into the office with guys that I'm ministering to and working with, and I'm walking in as a threat to them. So I have to be sure that I'm wearing a mask. I have to be sure that I'm doing all the stuff that's out there. Yeah, I have to be sure that I'm walking around with my booster. Whatever the next booster I need to take, I'm probably going to take it. Because then if I happen to get exposed somehow or another, then when I go home, I'm wearing a mask when I go home too, and this became kind of the life. So when I say, hey, take individual liberties off the table, I'm saying this because there's people to protect, and those people are going to be there, But another thing that I mentioned the first time around is the notion that workers that we didn't necessarily think were important were very important to us during the pandemic. I mean, many of us could just could take our work and be at home, work from our laptops, and we're okay. Your local Amazon driver, did your relationship change with your local Amazon driver? Did he become like your mailman? Like, you're gonna give him a gift by Christmas time, right? But then also the people that are working in restaurants, Uber drivers, people that are working at grocery stores, people that are not even to mention people that are intentionally exposing themselves to COVID every single day because they work in a hospital. The respect that we have for those people have to change, and just whether it's, knowing the name of the person that works in grocery store, they're all wearing name tags so you can use their name at the grocery store and saying thank you to them, all those kind of things. Just be aware and conscious of that as we go forward too. So thank you guys.
Cody.
Yeah, there's a lot that comes to mind. I'm going to try and synthesize it. Again, from my experience as a pastor, in the context in which I live, and I think it's interesting the different contexts that are represented in the room or on the screen. I think that kind of plays into some of how the response goes. I think for us at the table, we found it helpful. One, I think I share Pastor Berlin's vision of, man, I wish we could just move beyond the individual liberties conversation, like take it off the table. I don't know that that's a reality given the cultural climate in which we live. And so I think for me, I've got to dialogue it. I've got to talk it. I've got to engage it. And that's a lot of rural Montana leans with a disposition that really values individual liberty. And so that's been a central conversation that we've been trying to have. And I don't know if it's individual liberty is the problem as much as it is how we understand the nature of liberty. And so that I'll say that. And then I think the things that I had just reflected on before the panel is, I think with our church, in any space that we found to talk, whether it be on Zoom, over the phone, one-on-one, I think we found that openly acknowledging this balance is complex. just openly acknowledging that and saying, hey, there is no easy solutions, and where people are offering simple, easy solutions, just ask a couple of questions. That has served us well. And I found that just acknowledging this, it gives people the ability to breathe a little bit. And we're seeing that the language and the space for complexity is actually fertile soil for humility that bears fruit of unity. And so that's kind of been a formula that we've seen, is that when we acknowledge the complexity, get people in the conversation acknowledging that, there's a dispositional shift that can take place where people are a little bit more open to conversations. And so for me as a pastor, if I begin to start taking hard stances on certain things, I actually, there's a couple of risks that I've been trying to process. I still haven't figured it out, but if I begin to take a strong stance quickly on something I'm unsure of, I could potentially lose influence with about half the congregation, and therefore lose a potential ability to shepherd these people. And so I've had to learn that in my role, I'm in a different role than Trudy, than Phil. In my role, I've learned that restraint and research goes a little bit further than taking a strong position that you see on either side. We have one church in the Valley, for example, that said, if you get a vaccine, you are clearly, the language he used, this is a quote, this is not me summarizing, it's a quote, "You are an idiot." He said this from the stage, that if you do this and wear masks, you buy into that. That's really harsh. That's probably a caricature of most church that's probably a caricature of larger circles, but but you also have strong stances on the opposite end that also don't permit a space for dialogue. And so I think for me, it's been most beneficial to say, I'm going to restrain not be neutral. When people ask, I tell them very clearly where I stand on what principles I'm holding. But I think in the church space, practicing more restraint and doing a little bit more research has gone a lot further. And I also think, secondly, is that sometimes you can't balance these things, and that's okay. I think that's something that we try to acknowledge too. Like, for example, I've seen some beautiful moments in the life of the church where a group has gathered post the masks have come off now, and so they've gathered, there's no masks, but when someone wants to participate in this group that is asking for people to wear masks, I've seen the church rise to the occasion and put on masks for the sake of this individual. That's not balanced. It's not fair. It's the sacrificial love of, like, it's okay in that case for that to be imbalanced. And so as I'm reflecting on what does it mean to balance these things, sometimes imbalance is okay. And I think those are things that we've wrestled with.
Thank you, Cody. You really articulated so well the complexities between individual liberties and serving the common good. Kristen?
So much I could say. I think I want to highlight and continue a lot of what Cody's saying of the relational values that seem to be threatened in this period. I am a firm believer that we can do hard things together, especially with God's strength and his presence. I don't really think we're living very well like that, though, as a culture or a church. Our values and our capacity for collaboration, for mutual accountability, really to ourselves and to one another, for the ability to hold complexity, for the ability to be with people, even when we don't understand or they're suffering. There are great stories of those things and a lot of really poor, sad examples of the opposite on display, right? Even in the church. Yeah, and so many of those things, right? Being with in suffering is pretty incarnational. So many of those things point back to our faith. Being collaborative, even with people that are different, is really being made in the image of God and being a body together. And I don't know that we're doing those things very well. I'll just give the example of masks since that's been brought up a lot and that's a piece of this. We sometimes even, I think it depends on which circle you're in and which context, but sometimes we make that debate, you know, as small as what's my individual right versus what does the vulnerable need. And I don't think that's the whole question, because even with masks on, I'm really comfortable wearing a mask. I really debated a lot when they took them off at schools for my kids because of like, wait, but what about those kids that can't come anymore? I don't know what to do about that, but I know for when we keep the masks on, some people just want their way, but some people have trauma histories and wearing the mask is triggering of that. Some people read lips and wearing the mask prevents them from learning. Some people, little kids in classrooms, only know how to connect through facial expressions and are learning to do that. Nonverbal facial expressions is a huge amount of communication. So that's not to say, well, we should let people take them off, but that's to say, somehow there needs to be much bigger conversations that acknowledge the complexity and make space for benign curiosity. It's a phrase I love from graduate school. I would love to see us hold more benign curiosity for not just this is right, but what makes you think that, right? Often those I see who are the firmest about their views have some sort of risk. And I look and I'm like, yeah, this is really scary. Let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about how it's scary for your daughter, or how it's scary because if everything stays shut down, your business is going to close, you're going to lose your house. Let's go a little deeper here. I don't think we're doing that very well. And I think there's a lot of values that are threatened in the midst of that. But I will also add, before I turn it back over, we're focusing a lot on the lament and the struggles, and that's important. But I'm really convinced that God is at work too. And there's not just a threat to our values, there's opportunities as well, right? And we have opportunities to learn how to collaborate and care for one another better than we've ever done. We have opportunities to be more mental health friendly and trauma informed than we've ever been in our culture. We have opportunities to be thinking more about the holistic person, not just our heads or what we're able to produce, but where are our bodies in this maybe when they're triggered by stuff. We have a lot of opportunities here to, I think, live our values better than ever as individuals in the church. And so I don't want to miss that in this context and conversation as well.
Thank you so much. Now, the last question, we've almost covered it in multiple ways, but I want to put it slightly differently. I was going to ask, what action should we do to protect ourselves from this virus and protect the values that we cherish? I'm going to ask the question a little bit differently. How can we protect ourselves from the next pandemic? The more we as a human population intrude into the animal habitat, the more animal diseases will come in to humanity. And existing as we do as a global community, there's no stopping it. In 1960, when the world was young, a Chinese professor, one of my professors at the University of Kansas, told us how to deal with viruses. He was a worldwide virology specialist. He said, you test, you trace, and you isolate. Sounds simple, doesn't it? In a global world, I'm not sure you can do that. So tell me, panel, what do we do to prepare for the next one?
Okay, I'll try and be really quick. One of the other roles that I play is I'm on the member of the steering committee for the early learning and families for Washington County. As a faith voice, that in itself is an incredible privilege and honor because Washington County is one of the least church counties in the nation. And for them to allow me to come in as Northwest Christian Church, Tigard Campus, Faith Voice into this community of meeting needs for the Washington County was a huge privilege for me. And it's not one I take lightly. And I feel that that's where the church can come in and start exercising the ability to care about the community, to be able to be available to serve the community. And so for in our case, we're exercising opportunities on how can we provide for them. So for example, we've done, and this does not say that everybody in our church community is pro this, pro that, but there's a level of respect of compliance and respect that for the community and the rules that rule. And one thing that happened is we've been distributors for COVID-19 test kits to the early learning centers and the family providers, most of which are small, intimate little places that don't have access. We've hosted vaccine clinics for people to come. We've hosted blood drives when a lot of their facilities were shut down because we were geared in compliance with what Washington County was suggesting. We were able to house these things and these services. And as a result, we even started a pantry until the major pantries got their big funding and we could kind of wean off. We kind of filled in the gap. When they saw that we were willing to step alongside and to facilitate, it made a huge difference. And honestly, Zoom has also been a huge advantage for those that are vulnerable as well as those in the disability population, because we've been able to connect and meet regularly as in support groups. And it's like it's a norm now. And it's awesome because the stress of transportation or coverage has been eliminated because we're meeting even if it's on Zoom. And that in itself has created some good opportunities, creating a culture of adapting and pivoting and being welcoming.
Thank you. Phil.
I think one of the biggest things for me regarding to this is understanding that we're gonna have to live a little different, like going forward. The way things were before were not good for all of us, bottom line.
Yeah.
And so there's gonna be things that we're gonna have to incorporate in our lives going forward that, and hopefully lessons that we've learned from this past couple of years and incorporate in our lives going forward and be ready for that. But at the same token, there's a lot of us that just need space and grace to figure out what this new life is going to be. You know, coming back into big spaces, coming back where you're going to see people's whole faces again, you know, it's going to be a shock to some people right off the bat. So give people grace as we kind of reincorporate and get back around one another. I took my 80-year-old parents out to lunch last week for the first time in 2 years, right? And so, you know, that was strange, but we took a table and we were looking all skeptically at the people around us. Maybe a problem, but that's what we did. So it's what it is. But just understanding that there's going to be some new normals. There's going to be some things that we're going to have to get used to. Wearing a mask more often, getting a annual booster shot. I don't know. Restaurants and being distant and being concerned about where we are around people. That may be a thing that's a part of our lives. But just knowing that where we were before was not good for everyone. That's a reality.
Yeah.
That's a thing. And that, again, becomes the consideration that even though things may have worked well for any one of us individually, it didn't work well for everyone. And that should maybe be a part of the conversation. But then there's also those people that, again, came to work every day, you know, while many of us were at home working and stuff like that. And I mentioned earlier about respecting and caring for those guys more. But also their employers are going to have to respect and care for them more. You know, that's going to be another part of the conversation that maybe some of us may not be having, but there'll be some people that will be having those conversations. So, yeah.
Very good. Cody.
Yeah, I think to your question, I think how we might be able to situate ourselves. One, I do think this is another conversation, but I think we can ask, pray, demand a little bit more of our leaders entirely. I think that there was a sense where there was a political domestication of Jesus, and there was the political domestication of the pandemic, and neither of which served us well. And so I think that that's a big thing. I think we can ask, demand, and fight for those spaces to be a little bit more neutral. I think more on the ground, though. I think remaining approachable was central for us. I tried to make sure throughout the last couple of years that whoever is sitting in front of me, whether on Zoom or in person, felt safe, whether they are liberal or Republican, whatever, wherever they land on these various issues, whether they are vaccinated or have some questions about vaccinations. I tried to ensure that they had a safe place to process. And so I think remaining approachable is huge because these are complex issues that deserve nuance. I think another thing is and I'm speaking more for myself, but knowing my limits and my lane. I am not an immunologist. I am not an expert on virology. And I think that's okay to admit that. I think in 2020, we saw the rise where everyone was an expert on everything. And that created a lot of challenges for us. I'm not a therapist, so I think pastors need to learn when to refer, and they need to build relationships with therapists now. Most of our benevolence funding didn't go to groceries; it went to mental health from our church. The last thing I will say, or the last two things I'll say, is advocate for who's not in the room when you're having conversations. And so there's a phrase, being a devil's advocate. I don't like that phrase. I think we should just be an advocate. And I think that if I'm sitting with someone who's conservative, I'm going to advocate for the Democrat. If I'm sitting with someone who's a Democrat, I'm going to find a way to advocate for my conservative friends in ways that'll be better to build bridges. And so that's been helpful. And lastly, remembering that for the church, at least, I can't go any meeting without quoting New Begin. So I'm sorry. And if Paul's in the room, I'm sorry. But New Begin talks about God inhabits mostly the local. And so that might mean for us to be able to sign off and sit down for conversations, and keeping in mind that we are sent into this moment, not to sit it out as the church, but we are strategically sent into the moment to find ways to represent Jesus well as his witness and ambassadors. And so that's my take.
Thank you, Cody. Kristen.
What do we do? I already mentioned one thing, which is benign curiosity, good listening to other people. I got good news and bad news for you, though. You ready? You can't do good listening and benign curiosity unless you first do introspection and you know what you're carrying into the conversation. So I think that's one place we start, is we get honest about what we're carrying in to all these conversations, what we're afraid of, where we distrust authority or other groups, whatever it is. We gotta, so much I could say, but we gotta do that work. And then be curious listeners and good question askers who assume the best in other people, even when they're coming at us and they sound crazy or they sound so different than what we think. Assume the best and stay curious. Is there something under this anger or whatever it is they're bringing our way? Those are some general things, more in terms of mental health specifically. Whatever your sphere of influence, I think continuing to destigmatize mental health and the struggles by talking about it, that it's always been with us, mental health issues, and more now than ever, and it's okay if that's a struggle. Telling stories about people who are struggling and getting well. Providing resources for people. I love how Cody was talking about building relationships with therapists and referring to them. I think we're going to have to get more creative in the church too, though, where we're collaborating better to do more grief groups and parenting groups and marital groups and all the things inside the church. Some of that we do already, so it's not to say we don't, but I think the need for it, has been times 10, and we don't have times 10 therapists. So I think we're going to need to get creative about the groups and education and services we offer to really collaboratively to really serve people and their needs. Social support, obviously. Support the helpers. I'm with you there too, including pastors and therapists and all those on the front lines of the mental health pandemic. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we're out of time, is let's just walk into every place we go and assume that other people are struggling And that in some ways their bodies, the body is where we keep trauma, that in some ways their body might be unsettled. And I would love to see us be more integrated in how we approach things and do grounding exercises even. We can chat later about what that might look like, but you're lucky you're saved by the bell. I can't do any right now, but dang it. But figuring out ways to settle our nervous system in the midst of all the trauma before we even enter into hard conversations, learning, anything, to just assume there's a lot happening and take proactive steps to address that.
Thank you. I just checked, the panel did a wonderful job. I just checked with the atomic clock in Boulder, Colorado, and this clock is 5 minutes fast. So we have 5 minutes. Anybody line up right over here for those who want to ask questions to the panel. Come quickly. Who will come forward for a question? Come on, Brad. Don't check your clock. All right, then. Well, then I guess I'm going to ask you guys to ask questions among yourself, but let's respect the time because I was fibbing about the atomic clock in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah, right. Was.
You
And
had
we-
me for a second. I was like,
Sit in the
really?
room.
Oh.
Thank you again, panel. Let's give them a hand now.